the Specialist Impact Resilience Organisation. Rob and I have known each other for 15 years, I guess, probably about that. My husband served in the RAF at the same time as Rob, and Rob's short story is quite frankly amazing. I'm not saying that just because I'm his friend, but he has been in the front line of many of our military conflicts and been a Harrier pilot. He was at the top of his game before a near fatal ejection ended his fast jet career. A day none of us will ever forget, I don't think. We're very, very grateful that you're still here, Rob. We're here today to discuss about how he deals with resilience in that military environment and how everything is rehearsed, how the strategies are put in place, and how he then implemented all of those strategies in ejecting from a Harrier. He also has gone on to successfully run a business for 17 years with an 8-figure revenue turnover in the travel sector with his wife, and what that has taught him about the era of risk and resilience, because quite frankly, we've had quite a lot of that over the last few years. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you. What an introduction.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
I hope I can live up to it.
So Rob, let's begin at the beginning. Tell me about life as a fast jet pilot.
Wow, that's a big question to start with. Well, I mean, firstly, it is a huge privilege to fly one of those aeroplanes for the Air Force, but also for the Royal Navy. I did both, and it was a childhood ambition of mine. So I was extremely fortunate to be able to do that. Life as a fast jet pilot, it's not very Top Gun, I'm afraid.
That's disappointing.
Probably not what people want to hear. But it is fast paced, and demands a real focus of mind to get there in the first place, but then to continue to sort of operate under that lifestyle. It's very high pressure, and you're away from home a lot on a really practical basis. I mean, I was on the front line some years ago now, but we were away probably 5 months of the year every year, and night flying when we were back here and so on. So very, very hard on family life, but immensely rewarding in many other ways, and very exciting as well at times.
So in terms of, I know you were deployed during 9/11 as well, weren't you? You were out on HMS Illustrious at that point. How did that, because that was a risk that no one had foreseen, I guess. This is me going off the questions we pre-agreed, so apologies. But I know, because my husband was out there with you, that you were all ready to go and just have, it was a planned exercise. The bit of 2 aircrafts hitting the Twin Towers was not on anyone's risk or resilience planning sheets. And how did that evolve, and how did you then deal with the outfall from that point onwards?
No, it's a good point. I suppose it's a similar example to the pandemic arriving with no notice, and that one wasn't really on anyone's radar or risk register either. Yeah, we were on an aircraft carrier in Valletta Harbour in Malta when the Twin Towers happened, and yes, I'll never forget that day like everyone else. I think the answer to the question is that it was purely reactive. It had to be. So we were on our way to the Middle East via the Suez Canal to do a big exercise in Oman, and in the following hours and days that became, well, you're going to war, but we don't know where, but you're on a ship, so that's okay. And actually you can't use the Suez Canal because that's too dangerous now, so you're going to have to go all the way around Africa. And then all that changed as well, and we did go to Oman and do the exercise. So it was a period of immense disruption and a lot of reactive short-term plan making, but with an organization that was essentially developed to do that. Not just the squadron itself, but the ship we were on and the command and control structure that's in the military. The military is designed to be extremely flexible and reactive, but that was a uniquely disruptive event.
Yeah, I certainly won't. It's one I won't remember, won't forget for a very long time, like you. So back to relatively more recent times. So what happened in the lead up to you having to join the elite club of ejectees from aircraft?
We were just about to deploy back out to Afghanistan. The Harrier Force had been out there for quite a few years, and there were 3 frontline squadrons. I was on the Naval Strike Wing at the time, and it was coming up to our Roermond, our turn again. And I was doing a sortie with the Army to do practice close air support. So when we get airborne, talk to the Army on the ground and support them however they want. Got airborne with a wingman, and headed out towards Norfolk in a very this won't make much sense, but in a very heavy aeroplane, lots of fuel, lots of simulated weapons, targeting pod, and you're on your own in a Harrier. And when you take off, you're too heavy to land. So landing again relies on the fact that you burnt quite a lot of fuel or got rid of some of your weaponry or whatever. And I had a small green caption come on that said oil. And so that indicated there was some sort of problem with the oil system in the aeroplane. So I started to have to dump fuel because we weren't going to be able to do the sortie, so that I could come back to RAF Cottesmore, which is where I'd taken off from, to land again. But I couldn't land straight away because it was too heavy. So I had to spend 5 or 10 minutes dumping fuel to get down to an appropriate weight. Sadly, during that time, what had actually happened, and obviously we only found this out in investigation afterwards, was that all the oil in the engine, and it's an extremely big engine, and there's only one of them, it's a big Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine, all the oil had leaked out during the takeoff in about 90 seconds. So this massive engine was running with no lubrication at all. And amazingly, it ran perfectly well for quite a few minutes, to the extent I didn't really think that much was wrong. There were no indications of anything wrong at all in the cockpit, until I was much closer back to Cottesmore and fairly close to landing. And essentially, in layman's terms, the engine blew up. Probably the most dramatic sort of minute of my life, fighting the aircraft as it sort of disintegrated and caught fire around me. My wingman was flying in close formation about 6 feet away, and telling me that I was on fire, and there were 30-foot flames coming out the back of the aircraft, and telling me to eject. Air traffic control was telling me to eject because they were watching, they could see what was happening. But I did stay in the airplane initially, hoping that I could either put the fire out or relight the engine or do something. But in the end, the engine failed completely, and the Harrier doesn't glide without any power, and essentially it just fell out of the sky at that point, and I ejected about 4 seconds before it hit the ground.
But I had no idea it was that, A, that you caught on fire, and B, that you were that close to the ground.
Yeah, well, I was coming into land, so I had to be fairly close to the ground, and I'd stayed in it long enough to make sure really until I had no choice, because the aircraft was about to hit the ground and it wasn't flying anymore. It happened to happen just as I was above a village called Ashwell, for those that know the area in Rutland. So again, I stayed in the aircraft just long enough to roll the aircraft away from the village, leading to the sort of classic headlines the next day in the local papers about heroes avoiding schools and stuff. But that did happen, and I ended up under a parachute, and luckily landing in an open field.
Wow. And how, I know that a lot of military life is about risk and resilience and planning and planning and planning, and you have, before every sortie, this is anecdotal, so I haven't ever been in the military, but married to one for a number of years. Yes. You plan and you have weather discussions, and you discuss all the risks that could happen. What was it like to actually deliver and follow through on that, on that impact of having to eject?
I mean, I've thought about it a lot. It is a really, again, a bit like the 9/11 example, quite an extreme example, but it is an example of having had a plan and then having rehearsed that plan so that when you have to use it, it's second nature, even in a really extreme moment of peril. I mean, the plan in this case, when you look at the design of a fighter aeroplane, you think about all the things that could go wrong, and you, generally speaking, like any airplane, not just a fighter airplane, put in backup systems and so on. So an aircraft will have 2 hydraulic systems and 2 electric systems, and there's a backup if the battery fails, there's a generator, or there's another battery, or whatever. So most things are replicated in one way or another. The Harrier, because of the uniqueness of its design, only has 1 engine, which again is really unusual for a frontline fighter aircraft, because if 1 engine fails, you've still got the other. But with only 1 engine, essentially anything that gets in the way of that working, in this case it running out of oil and blowing up, there really is no other option at that point. The aircraft's not going to fly, so you run out of things to do. So they design in an ejection seat. So that's the plan. In terms of rehearsal, fortunately, we're in a position where we can go and rehearse in a fairly realistic simulator, and we're required to do that every single month for years and years and years.
Wow.
And you go through a simulation of all forms of failure, but including engine failure and having to eject and having to make that decision to eject. Probably dozens, if not hundreds of times before I actually had to do it. And so when it came to the moment, and again, I only know this because of what they looked at afterwards, but they showed that I was trying to relight the engine with my left hand, because that was a motor program, because I'd done it so many times in the simulator. Because the engine had failed, you need to relight it. So my left hand was trying to relight the engine, while my right hand was pulling the ejection handle, because part of my brain was going, this is not survivable, I have to leave now. And so that decision in the moment was the result of a lot of rehearsal, which, if you take this whole scenario and apply it to business, which we'll come on to shortly, I'm sure it's about having a plan and then making sure you know how to use the plan.
Yeah, and I think there's a quiz that we'll send out after this webinar that people can do to understand the risk and the resilience that they have already within their organisations. I did it for mine yesterday, and I think it's safe to say there's room for improvement. But yeah, I think that's one of the challenges of owning a business, is the fact you are constantly finding room for improvement, whether that be looking at your social strategy or whether it be more serious things like looking at your risk and resilience. Yeah, and as we said with Tom Warner last week, you know, he made calculated risks on when to order the board, and yes, he's got money tied up in board, but you know, it was a risk that he felt he was informed to make and was making the best decision at that time. And I think it's very easy for business owners to beat themselves up about making those decisions and taking the wrong risks and feeling like they haven't made the right decision at the right time. And that's human nature. We can't ever kind of mitigate that risk. It's just making those informed decisions at that moment in time. So in terms of you leaving the Air Force / Navy, you have both badges. What have you learned about that time, and how is that now helping you run Impact Resilience?
That's a good question. I mean, there's quite a big gap between the military and what I do now. So certainly I think the experience of all that, there's a few things. One is that I no longer have a mindset based on purely on optimism and hope. When something really extreme happens to you, and I'm sure we've all got examples, whether it's a car crash or something out of the ordinary, but it happens out of the blue, you really can't ever from that point onwards think, well, it's not going to happen to me, because it has. And so I think my attitude towards resilience and how we make our organizations stronger, which is really our mission here on in, to make Britain more resilient, because we're going to have to do it ourselves. No one's going to do it for us. Is to think about, realistically think about all the things that could happen, and really divide it into two. What can you do to prevent things happening? So if you're at threat of being invaded, you build yourself a castle. and that prevents you getting ransacked because you put really big walls around yourself. That's prevention. And then mitigation. So if the worst does happen, what can you do to reduce the impact of it, to literally to mitigate it? So I think very much in those two terms, and took that thinking into our business that we started Tots2 Travel nearly 20 years ago, which was, when I think about it in hindsight, all about dealing with risk. We specialized in creating holidays for people with very young children who had really quite specific needs, and that was the result of our then 2-year-old son who fell in a swimming pool when we were in France and nearly drowned. And luckily, it's a happy story. My father-in-law jumped in and rescued him, but we were very, very close to a terrible tragedy there. And if you think about that example, as difficult as it is to think about it, but it happened to us. With a risk like that of a child drowning, there's no point really thinking about what the mitigation measures are, how you're going to reduce the impact of it if it happens. You have to prevent it happening. That's it. It's all about prevention.
And
So
you must have, as in Tots, we were had a couple of Tots2 Travel holidays, and I think it was the risk of the venue not being safe was absolutely paramount in the consumer's mindset when shopping, but also the fact that you'd taken away the need to pack a small Arctic lorry to go on holiday with you, because everything that was child friendly was already there. So it was a great experience in terms of mitigating risk and also giving parents a safe place to actually have a holiday.
Yeah, so there are many levels. I mean, we talked about the extreme there, which is your child falling into the pool and drowning. The prevention, of course, is to put a fence around the pool, which was one of the many solutions there actually were. But yeah, there's the risk of not having a great holiday, not having a restful holiday, not having a holiday where you create family memories. So we were putting a lot of the solutions in place that made the outcome for families exactly what they wanted, and really protecting them from the more extreme risks. And we did that for 15 years, grew it very successfully, had probably all of the problems that Tom talked about last week in terms of experience of disruption, different industries, travel and food, but the challenges of growing a business from an idea up to scale are the same. And so a huge amount of learning there. One good example was we got investment, our first investment from a VC, a venture capitalist. And when we met him in London, one of his questions was, because we'd been pitching this idea of creating our own resort in Tenerife, and that's really why we wanted the investment. And he felt, I think, that there was a lot of eggs in one Tenerife-sized basket. And he said, well, what happens if the volcano in Tenerife goes off? Because it's the highest point in Spain. It's a massive volcano. It is completely dormant. But what happens if that goes off? And what he was saying really is that we need to diversify. We needed to have other SKUs, other product lines in other places, so that if one got disrupted, we could still keep trading. And as a result of that, we also created a resort in Lanzarote, but 2 in mainland Spain, 1 in France, and 1 in Italy. So we diversified our risk. I mean, what he couldn't have then predicted was a few years later the entire world shutting down. Which is, then again, for someone like him, a good example of how difficult we find it as human beings to assess the probability or the likelihood of major disruption when we're actually not very good at it.
But it's actually quite hard to kind of balance the risk and resilience in day-to-day life without being melancholy and permanently looking for the danger and the trauma and the what ifs. From a mental health perspective, as well as a positive pushing your business forward perspective.
I think there's a danger of that, but I think by advising that you look for the risks, I'm not also at the same time, it's a bit, I suppose it's a bit of a it sounds contradictory, or a paradox, but it's not a mandate for being negative.
No.
If you, I think you will find if you do an exercise, and we can come on to this, in horizon scanning, which is what it's called, where you look at all the possible threats, or you try and think about all the possible threats that you can, and then you prioritize them, and you start thinking about what you'll do, and you make a plan. You actually find yourself feeling a lot more confident about life, because once you accept that the risks are out there and they may happen to you, knowing that you have a plan and that you've thought about it makes you much stronger. And really, that's the whole point of resilience. Resilience is about strength. It's your strength to respond and adapt and recover from disruption and to keep going. If you have plans in place so that you know you can do that, or you're giving yourself a better chance of doing that, then actually I think that's a really positive message.
Yep, agreed, definitely. So in terms of the Tots to Travel journey, you've made reference to then COVID came. What's happened and how did COVID affect Tots to Travel?
Well, I mean, what happened to the travel industry is well documented. We had, so if we go back to January 2020, we just had a record January. January is always the biggest month in travel, for trade, for bookings. And we had just also agreed a second round of private equity funding, and we were on our, we just had a very successful 2019. And so we were powering into 2020. And then the first inklings of this virus appeared sort of late the previous year and into January. By March, essentially, business had gone to zero. So from millions of pounds in January, we'd gone to zero. I remember it quite clearly because I had to sort of bring out my old, more military form of leadership. Because if you remember back, initially small parts of Italy were closed down, the ski resorts, and you couldn't go to various bits of Italy. And I remember one morning very clearly when they just shut the whole of Italy. And then a couple of days later, they shut the whole of Spain. And it was a Saturday morning, and I had to get the sort of key members of our team back into the office and do literally stand around a whiteboard and go, we haven't got plans for this. And I think that was the first morning where we began to understand the potential scale of what was happening and what was about to happen. And yeah, and then it did within a couple of weeks, and then we went into lockdown. Revenue literally went to zero, and then it went into reverse because we had to refund, hundreds and hundreds of people and hundreds of thousands of pounds. And we kept going for about 6 months in the hope that it would pass and so on, but obviously it didn't. And in the end, as a company, relatively small, speaking for the travel industry at least, we weren't resilient enough financially to be able to keep going. The only travel companies that got through COVID were the ones that were well capitalized or well backed by the banks or by their investors, and were able to, I mean, in the end, just spend enough money to get through if they had it. And many travel companies weren't, sadly, and we were one of those.
And so what, both you and Wendy and the team for Tots Travel have all gone off to deliver new chapters. You are still flying, I believe, back in the RAF or the Navy. I'm not sure which one.
Yeah, no, Air Force, you're right. No, I'm very lucky. I went back to my previous career. I now part-time, as well as doing what I'm doing now. I'm a senior instructor in the Royal Air Force. I teach other instructors how to teach flying, and I'm a senior aviation supervisor as well. So I supervise all the flying that goes on a sort of duty basis where I fly from. Yeah, so back doing that, but very much also back into business, back into growing a business again, and really with this mission about, as I mentioned earlier, about resilient Britain, which is the sort of theme that we've latched onto because of the experience from my military aviation, but also business, and this sort of era of permacrisis, to use a word that's just been voted as the word of the year by Collins Dictionary, permacrisis, meaning that the degree of disruption that we're all experiencing because of Brexit or Ukraine or cost of living, inflation, supply chain disruption, post-COVID, and all that sort of stuff just rumbles on and overlaps. It's not one peak of disruption, it's just an ongoing, permanent situation, which I think does define a new era. And no one is going to rescue us from that. The state is not going to rescue us from that. The sort of state aid that we saw with furlough and the help with energy bills and so on, we're already seeing the cost of that. There's not going to be more. So I feel that it's really, really important that we take responsibility for our own resilience and do whatever we can. And that's why with my business partner and Wendy, my wife, we've started Impact Resilience so that we can help organizations, but mainly businesses, become stronger and become more resilient in this new era.
And I think there's an awful lot that can be done within that. I know last week when we were talking to Tom, he was saying about things like cyber attacks, which I guess are more commonplace and more openly discussed. But I know when we were talking about doing this webinar, we were discussing, historical events such as horse meat and how Finders had to put their risk and resilience plans into place to not only protect their brand, but actually look at their supply chain and understand where the horse meat had got into the supply chain system. What kind of top advice would you give to a food brand if they're looking at risk and resilience in relation to supply chain?
Wow, yeah, I mean that's a huge thing. It's probably the biggest thing for the food industry as a whole, I guess, is supply chain. And another way of putting that is the dependencies that you have on third parties to supply you what you need to produce what it is you sell. And actually, that's the same in all industries. I think a bit like travel, the food industry seems to be particularly vulnerable to disruptions to supply chains. So my advice actually on that would be the same as it would be for any company or in any industry. And I can go into some tips in a minute that would certainly answer that question and apply to the food industry. But I think specifically with third-party risk and supply chains, and I'm sure all our listeners and all the companies you work with will be doing this, but you have to try and de-risk the situation by assessing the companies who supply you. So you need to be resilient, yes, but they need to be resilient too, and they should have business continuity plans, and you have every right to ask to see them and to validate them and to ask how they validate them. So that would be, I think, the most obvious answer to that question above and beyond the sort of more general advice I can give.
And what are the specific things that you think food businesses need to be aware of in terms of, all elements of risk and resilience? It's easy for me to say.
Well, I think there's a lot to it, but I think you shouldn't be overwhelmed by that. I think the main thing is actually to do something and to make a start with it. Now, we might have people listening that have just started in a very small companies all the way up to very large. So the degree to which you implement some form of business continuity management in your business will clearly depend on the scale of your business, but it really doesn't matter what the scale is. You have to do something if you're a very small business.
Do you think, because that's a really interesting point, because there's a lot of people who create kind of lifestyle businesses and they're just like making things and then selling them, but there are other people who go, okay, I'm on a 5-year trajectory, I'm going to build this brand and I'm going to sell it for £1 million. Do you think more business owners need to adopt the mentality of creating really robust foundations, including those risk and resilience and contingency plans from day one?
Absolutely. I think the degree to which you spend resource, so your time, effort and money, has to be relative to the scale of your business and the cost and the benefit of doing so. But even if you are intending to be a small company and stay that way, even as a lifestyle business, then if you are the victim of some form of cyber attack or your main supplier goes under or whatever, then your lifestyle goes. So it is still really important to think about this, but just to make sure the solutions that you choose and the plans you have are relevant to the scale that you're operating at.
Okay, and in terms of what kind of 5 things you think food and drink businesses should be doing right now, what's on your top list?
Right, that's a great question. These aren't in any particular order, so they aren't a sort of 1 through 5, start at the top and work your way down. And I've promised I will write them down and send them to you, so people can download an easy guide and so on, as well as the quiz we've already talked about that we'll come back to at the end. I think, however, I would start with this one. I suppose it's slightly out of the box, a bit like Tom last week, starting with personal resilience. I really like that answer. Having been a founder and an entrepreneur myself and been through all of that, I truly understand how much it takes out of you. So my first bit of advice isn't something particularly tangible, like do a bit of analysis. It's all about mindset.
Okay.
And I think as human beings, and I sort of referred to this earlier, we have an optimism bias, particularly if if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting your own business. You have to have an optimism bias, or you just wouldn't do it. And it's very easy to go along thinking, like I said earlier, that things won't happen to you and that everything you read about is always happening to other people. I think you have to have a more defensive approach and think more when rather than if. So a good example would be Operation London Bridge, which was the plans around the death of the Queen and what was going to happen after that. And essentially it was, if not the largest in the world, one of the world's largest ever security operations. I mean, just extraordinary, the scale of it. Now, no one knew when that was going to happen, but they did know it was going to happen. So they had to make plans, made huge plans, rehearse them so that when it happened, they could roll them out really, really quickly. You need to think the same way about some of your biggest risks. And if you think, okay, I'm sort of hoping this isn't going to happen, I'm ignoring it, and you change that to, or I challenged to you and said, well, why not just assume it is going to happen? Now, what are you going to do about it? Because you're in the relatively luxurious position of it not having happened yet. So there is some time to think about it and to plan accordingly. And that's really all about mindset. And if you are in a larger organization, then that mindset needs to extend culturally to everyone in the organization. So it becomes a mindset where you think, what do we need to achieve? What are our priorities? What's going to stop us achieving those things? And what can we do about that now? And if things do disrupt us, what's our backup plan? And how are we going to continue going? That really is a mindset. And that's what I certainly was taught and learned through the experience and obviously the hard way in military aviation. It's just a mindset. So
is there anything else? I know we're talking about mental health and kind of team stuff over the coming weeks with the other webinars, but in terms of, you know, Tom talked about his 6-minute journal. Is there anything that you do that really helps your mindset in achieve the best results possible?
Yeah, I similarly to Tom, we've been through journaling in detail, and he had a 6-minute journal. We had a 5-minute one, so his is probably better than ours.
By a minute.
Yeah, by a minute. It spends a minute longer, but certainly the main points around gratitude in there are really, really important. I do more physical exercise now, weirdly, than I ever did when I was in the military, because I've learned to enjoy it. But that for me clears my mind, and I've always managed to sleep well. Actually, my brain doesn't come alive at 3 in the morning. I think that's a personality type thing. Wendy, my wife, struggles to turn her brain off at night, and she's much more like Tom.
Yeah, I'm in Wendy and Tom's camp.
Yeah. So I think, for me, and it's personal, I think physical activity, physical health aligned to eating really, really well, and gratitude and things like that. We've tried all sorts of other things, and we sort of settled, Wendy and I have settled on our own things, but weighted blankets, bed of nails, meditation, guided meditation, yoga, supplements. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So if you're not into any of those things and you just suffer stress and you have sore shoulders and you can't sleep at night, then yeah, it's like putting your own oxygen mask on first. That's a red light. It's an alarm, and you need to do something about that first. And I know Nikki's going to talk about that a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, I was listening to a podcast on the way down to London, and he was saying, you know, I take magnesium before I go to sleep because it helps me sleep. And I think, and they were talking about the fact that it's actually cool to have a counsellor. You know, it's fine to talk about your problems with someone that isn't part of your friendship group, your peers. And I think that's one of the lasting things from the pandemic is, you know, we're both talking, I'm in my kitchen, you're in your study. You know, there are boundaries that have come down because of the pandemic, and therefore mental health is far more further up the agenda. And actually, people should be less afraid to ask questions. So as an agency, we have a policy that you have to channel your inner 4-year-old, because age 4, you really want that biscuit. There is no risk attached to you having that biscuit, but you want it. So you go and ask for it. And actually, we've asked for things around collaborations, all sorts of things. And what's the worst that someone says no? But actually, unless you ever take that leap, you're not going to strive, and you're not going to take your business forward, and you're not going to come across those challenges that then give you more opportunities and build even bigger bags of resilience that you can take forward and take to the next chapter.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting strategy for overcoming barriers and fear, I think, as well. I think we all carry a lot of fear with us. And going back to the point I made previously about addressing risks head on by thinking about them and planning for them, what you are doing there is addressing the fear of something happening and becoming more resilient, because you go, actually, that would be okay because we've got a plan. And that helps you sleep better at night. And as the person, if you're the entrepreneur or the business owner or the CEO or whatever, you know, you feel very, very responsible for the business and the well-being of everyone that works there and so on. You know, that's a great thing. And to your point on vulnerability from a personal point of view, I couldn't agree more with any of that. After my crash, I bottled things up terribly, and had a real problem subsequently. That said, when you are the leader and people look to you, they want to feel confident themselves in your leadership and in your own strength. So there's a degree of needing an outlet for your vulnerability, and hence, yes, talking to someone else professionally, whether it's under the guise of coaching or anything else, is an excellent thing to do.
Yeah, and I definitely think there's your tribe out there. So if it is that you hate networking, well, then find another way of doing it. But actually, as a business owner and an entrepreneur, I find that it's absolutely invaluable to get out there and connect with people. And it doesn't matter what sector you're in, the problems and the risks are relatable. And you often pick up pearls of wisdom from other people just through having a cup of coffee and a natter.
I couldn't agree more. And that's actually another one of the 5 tips that I wanted to bring to this, and you brought it out really, really nicely there, is that you don't have to be alone on this. Particularly if we're talking about resilience, the threats and your own vulnerabilities, you may think you are uniquely vulnerable, and it's a problem that you have, but you're not unique in any way, really, in that respect. And when people do, or when you find you are the victim of being targeted online through a cyber attack or anything, you know, if they're not being vindictive to you personally, you're probably one of 50 companies they've attacked that day. You know, it's not unique to you. So you can talk to your peers, your suppliers, your competitors, even your industry through networking and the Grub Club and all the amazing things you do. I'm really looking forward to to that tonight, to getting out there and meeting people and talking openly about risk and resilience in all its forms, because everyone has to address this, and you can get help as well as realizing that it's not unique to you. There are people out there, there are organizations out there, huge amount of resource online as well, which can help. And as soon as you ask for that help or get someone in, then you will start to be stronger personally, but also as an organization, and you'll start to feel better about it.
We're definitely stronger together as a business community and as a community of entrepreneurs and like-minded people. There was a really good example, I think it was 2 weeks ago, with Dahlia Beach, who are she's an amazing lady. She is a videographer and photographer who during the pandemic lost all her work and started creating a dahlia garden at Millets in Oxfordshire, and now sells dahlia bulbs and dahlias. But she had her bank closed, just literally closed it overnight, HSBC, and she shared it, and she said she was really embarrassed to share this failure because she felt it was a very personal failure. And I don't think any of us would have on our risk list that the bank would just turn around and close your account.
No.
But since she's vocalized it, hundreds and hundreds of other people have reported exactly the same thing. So by sharing, they've created one voice and are much stronger to be able to take on that challenge, be more resilient, and actually name and shame, which I don't think is doing HSBC any favors. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Did also from saying what the problem was there any help from the community of people that responded with solutions as well?
There was, and she got lots of other service providers got mentioned. It also got taken up by national media. So and she got a response back from HSBC, who were holding on to her money, which meant she couldn't pay her bills. So yeah, it did help solve the problem. Yeah, and it's opened up the discussion because it's not something I would have had on my risk list, but it does make you think about the ethics of where you bank, who you bank with, how that platform works for you. Yes, it's a faff to change, so it's not a kind of route you want to go down unless you have to, but it's something that you need to consider because it appears to be something that's happening more often than.
Yeah, and that's really the sort of second order benefit of that, is that a lot of people listening will have put in place some form of solution to a disruption precisely because it happened to them. So reactively, they lost their data one time, or their website went down. They went, oh Christ, how do we prevent that happening again? Or what will we do if that happens again? You back up your data, or you get a website on a different data center, and you do all that. When you hear about these things that happened apparently out of the blue, and things you didn't even know that could happen, like your bank account just being closed, then you're able to be proactive and add that to your list of potential risks, and think about what you're going to do if that happens, and think about why that happened, and are you vulnerable to that happening, and perhaps in that case even speak to your bank saying, could that happen to me? What would it take for you to do that, and so on. So by listening to other people's experiences and by sharing your own, you really, it's very generous, if you like. You're giving other people the opportunity to not have the same problem.
Yeah, and from a very personal perspective, I lost my brother 4 years ago to sudden adult death syndrome, and it was something that none of us could have ever foreseen coming. He was fit, he was healthy. From the outside, there was nothing wrong. But what's really interesting is having gone through having my heart tested at Papworth and reading about the syndromes that contribute to sudden adult death syndrome, of which Bugarda syndrome is one of them. It's about, now I know more about the risks. So if you have an upset stomach, for example, you should take Diarrhea. And that should be part of a process, just like you would do with flying a jet or getting in your car, because it puts the good stuff back into your body. So if your body is fighting and has any underlying conditions, having the right level of electrolytes back in your body keeps it functioning. But I wouldn't have known that had I not gone through that and been tested resilience to the absolute max. But it's about learning those things and then sharing them. And as the food marketing experts, we're really keen that we share as much as possible, which is why we put these webinars on and why we're talking to incredibly useful folks like yourself to share and help people be stronger together, because it's so important. But you've covered off 2 of your top 5. I will stop interjecting and contributing and let you finish the other 3.
It's really useful because it's a discussion and it helps bring out the point. The next 3 really are much more practical ones, which some people will like. I think the first one is of those 3 is to make someone accountable for business continuity in your business. And again, it might be you if you're the CEO and the founder and the entrepreneur, and there aren't many of you. If you're in a large organization, I'd recommend delegating the accountability to someone very senior on the board level or exco level, and then giving someone below that responsibility for it as well as a senior manager.
Okay.
So that there is a focal point. Otherwise, it tends to be something that drops down your list because there's so many urgent and important things that you have to do today as the founder, entrepreneur, CEO, that it sort of drops off the list, and everyone else thinks that everyone else is doing something when they're not. So it's a really simple one, but it brings the whole subject out into the daylight when you say to someone, you are accountable for this. It's part of your job role, it's part of your job description. Here's how we're going to measure it, and all the normal things you do when you give someone accountability for something. So include business continuity in that. The next one is about trying to demystify the complexities around this and trying to make it simple enough that people, particularly if you have never done anything like this in your business, is to try and simplify it to the point where you can at least make a start, because there's lots of language around this and that can put people off, but it's actually not that difficult. So I would recommend literally take one bit of paper, a blank bit of A4, and make a business continuity management system, a BCMS, which is in the end the gold-plated solution to all of this, on one bit of paper. And you can literally do that. So start with thinking about what's your top product or service. You know, the one thing that if I took away from you at midnight tonight would be the biggest disaster for you, that everyone's got one. And then underneath that, list all the processes, all the things, but processes that you use as a business to turn inputs into outputs to produce whatever that product or service is. So think about that, but also all the dependencies you have both inside your company and outside your company. So a classic obviously would be if you run a digital company, is whoever hosts your website and hosts all the data for your website, that is an external dependency. You depend on them to keep your website up and running. And if you don't have your website, you can't sell whatever it is you sell. So that would be an external dependency. So list all of those things. Then think about, this is where the sort of hard bit is, if you like, because you're going to have to force yourself to think about what happens if you lose any of those processes or dependencies. So if you lose power to your production plant, what are you going to do? How's that going to impact you? If you lose your website, what are you going to do? If you lose a key person that you're dependent on, who has all the knowledge in their head, what are you going to do? And how long can you last before that disruption becomes critical to the ability of your company to keep trading? All right, and so for some companies, that, and depending what it is and what the problem is, that might be measured in hours, for some days and maybe even weeks, and that's called your maximum tolerable period of disruption. So you really need to know, how long can this company, can I keep going if we are disrupted that badly? And then you're able to prioritize all of your processes and all of your dependencies based on that number, and you know how long you've got, so you can then make a plan to recover within that time and think about what are you going to do to prevent it happening in the first place. So going back to building walls around you to prevent attack, and then thinking about what you're going to do to reduce the impact on you if it does happen. And those are all the solutions you can put in place. And then you just write it down, you write a plan. And in the end, if you do that on one bit of paper, you end up with, albeit a very simple version, but you end up with a business continuity plan. And then if you publicize that with your team, get them to think about it and formalize it, and everyone knows about it, you can then rehearse it and check it works. But
Oh, I think we've lost Rob. So he seems to have vanished and frozen at the same time. So I was going to carry on chatting about his questionnaire that he was going to run. So once we have finished today's webinar, hopefully Rob will be back joining us shortly. We will then share this video so you can watch it again and share the tips. So Rob is writing his 5 tips down, which we will share as a free download on the website. And we will also be sharing this questionnaire that will take you 10 minutes, if that, to complete. But it will just give you an oversight as to where the risks are within your business, and then what you can do to mitigate those risks and put in resilience planning to enable you to really go forward and thrive. It doesn't look like Rob is going to be able to join us again. I think they've obviously had a major Wi-Fi outage in Stamford this morning. So I will wrap things up and say that we have our next webinar next week, which is with Wendy and Andrew, and they will be discussing teams and how you get that mindset into your team, how you build the resilience within your team to be able to go forward and take on whatever next year has in store. Rob, are you back? You're back. Sorry, I was just building up for next week's webinar so that in the meantime we had some talking.
I'm on a different computer, which I suppose is an example of resilience.
Well
So
done.
I have no idea. That one's still frozen.
Yeah, we didn't discuss this as part of the plan, but hey, we both coped with it. So, which is cool.
Yeah, a good example of being disrupted, but having a plan, which in this case was a spare computer.
Perfect. So yeah, so we were just, yeah, if you want to carry on talking about your 5 tips, I don't know where we got to in terms of you froze for quite a while and then you just literally vanished.
Yeah, so we were just talking about taking one page and doing a really, really simple business continuity process that I'll detail when I send you the writing and people can download, and that will get you going on this process. So if there's a fear of the unknown, there's a fear of starting, that should really, really help. And the 5th one is, and people ask me this the whole time when I'm working with clients, is like, okay, so if there was one thing I could do, what would it be? And almost invariably, the answer is IT security, cyber security, because it's the one threat that seems to be growing massively, but also applies to pretty much everyone. Even if you don't sell much through your website, you are bound to use data, even internally, for example. And if that data becomes vulnerable and it gets nicked by someone, then you have a big problem on your hands. So there's also the point about this is there's a big difference between IT and IT security. They're 2 entirely different industries. So even if you have a great IT team, a great head of IT, that doesn't mean that they're experts on IT security. And we've seen this over again, where with a partner tech company we go into companies and find the most surprising number of vulnerabilities that they're surprised about as well. But the good news is that they can be fixed almost overnight. But you need someone to come in and do a review of your posture, your cyber posture, so that if it's all great, good news, you get a tick. It's like being audited, and you know you're strong. But invariably you're not, and there are vulnerabilities, but they can be patched quite easily. And it doesn't have to be a very expensive thing to do either. So if you were to do one thing, it would be to get your IT security looked at independently.
The other thing I would add to that is making sure that you are GDPR compliant and that you have your ICO certificate, because it's all too easy to have a database and not be compliant with those rules. It's a really to get ICO certificate is really low cost per annum. It means then you're, pardon?
£25 a year if you pay by direct debit. Yeah.
And it's a darn sight cheaper than legal fees if you're caught in breach of holding on to data when you aren't registered to do so. So I would categorically, if you haven't got that, get that on the list today.
Yeah,
and then get your IT
like, PCI compliance if you use credit cards or you take credit cards over the internet and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, so it's great, some great tips. But lastly, so those are the 5 things. You'll be able to download those in a simple guide. But we've put together a really simple quiz. It takes about 60 seconds. If you are wondering about your resilience as an organization and you've not really started this journey, or you have and you want to know how effective it is, then it's just 12 questions that you'll answer, and the quiz will automatically give you an indication of how vulnerable you are in which areas, or how strong you are, or other areas you need to improve, but also tips on what you can do about it and how to get help. And we help companies of all shapes and sizes in a lot of detail, or just at a high level as well. So we're here to help, and I'm very happy to take any individual questions if people want to contact me through LinkedIn or through you, Vari. Very happy to help.
Well, I would like to say thank you, and thanks for showing so much resilience in popping in and out of today's webinar. We're really looking forward to sharing the quiz with you and sharing the guide with you. Next week we are talking all about teams, so it's going to be an exciting discussion as to how you build that team mindset and combat risk and resilience within that. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on this week's webinar, and I will see you tonight at Grub Club. Yeah, and we will be sharing the details with everybody soon. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Vari.